Welcome back to another video on iOS and Android notifications for Flutterflow. In this guide, we're going to see how you can use Supabase as your backend and still use the native Flutterflow notification settings. This will require Firebase authentication, but because of a Supabase update in the recent months, it's a whole lot easier than it was before. So in the first 15 minutes of this video, I'm going to show you how you can set up the built-in notifications for Flutterflow using Supabase as your backend. And the other 15 minutes, I'll show you a real-life example of how I'm transferring a current Supabase project to use this new system. So without further delay, let's get started. All right, so the first step for this guide is to create a Firebase project and connect it to Flutterflow. I've gone ahead and created my project in Firebase. You can scroll down here in this guide and click on this link, or just head to the Flutterflow docs. If you go to Firebase on the left, connect to Firebase, you'll have the step-by-step instructions on how to set up your project, allow Flutterflow to have the proper permissions, and connect it to your Flutterflow project. So I went ahead and did that, and if I go to Firebase here, you can see I've enabled authentication. For the sign-in methods, I've enabled email and password. There's no users yet. I've created a Firestore database, so I've just started one. There's no data in it, and I've enabled functions. When you go to enable functions, you will be asked to upgrade to Blaze plan. That's fine. That's required for this to work, and also for Flutterflow notifications to work. So you go ahead, you upgrade to the Blaze plan, and then you're all set. And so I did this setup on the Firebase side, and then in Flutterflow, if I go to settings and Firebase, you can see if I scroll down, my project has been connected and I've generated the config files. So if we go back to our guide here, this will complete step 1 and step 2 of this guide. Now, before we go to step 3, please ensure that you've given the proper permissions to Flutterflow on your Firebase project. If you follow their guide step by step, there should be no issue, but you need to make sure that this is properly set up for the following steps to work. So once that's done, we're ready to move ahead with step 3. We're going to get set up and complete step number 3. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and create the custom actions for this to work. So basically what we're going to be doing is using Firebase as our authentication platform. And then once we're connected with Firebase, we're going to take the token, the Auth token from Firebase, and still use Supabase as our backend. And Supabase will recognize the token from Firebase and allow user access via this token. And the way it's going to do that is from step number 4, I believe. No, step number 5, where we're going to be connecting Firebase and Supabase together. So then you'll be able to use all these apps as you would normally in Flutterflow without any custom code, just by using Firebase for authentication and Supabase as a backend. So let's go back to step 3.1. What we're going to do is copy this piece of code here. This first code is going to capture the new tokens that Firebase generates every few hours to keep our user authenticated. And it will take the token and set it as the token to use for Supabase calls. And that will do that automatically, so you don't have to worry about it. So I copied the piece of code. I'm going back to Flutterflow here. Going to go to custom code, add an action. I'm going to select everything and just delete it and paste the copied code. And the last thing I will do is name this action update Supabase token to match the code down here. I'm going to click on save. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but Flutterflow added this line here when I click on save. So I'm going to remove that and save again. Now we want this code to handle the new tokens automatically. So what we're going to do is go to main.dart, and in the final actions, we will add our update Supabase token and save. So when the app starts up, our code will run, and it's designed to remain active and listening to new Firebase tokens and update them as they come in. Now, if we go back to the guide, step 3.2 is also another piece of code. And this is because the token that's generated from Firebase does not have every information that Supabase requires. More specifically, the Supabase tokens all have a parameter named role, and it's always set to authenticated when the user is authenticated. And by default, the tokens that Firebase generates don't have this parameter. So in step number 4 here, we're going to create a cloud function that will run whenever a new user is created in Firebase to add this role parameter to the token. So everything will be handled automatically again, but this means that it introduces an issue that can be caused by a slight delay in all our different codes running. So when we create a new user in Firebase, once we have everything set up, the user will be created, our code from step 4 will run, and it will add the role parameter to tokens. And in Flutterflow, in our app, we may have continued the login process before everything happened. If that happens, it means that if we try to fetch data from Supabase, the role parameter won't be set on the token yet, and Supabase won't recognize the token as valid. Obviously, all of this will happen in milliseconds, but in the event that this happens, there is a second code here that we will run immediately after user creation in our app in order to check if the role parameter has been added to the token. If it has not, it will wait up to 1 second and prompt a new token again that will contain this role parameter. So all that to say that this second piece of code will run immediately after user creation in Flutterflow. So we'll do create new user for Firebase, run this piece of code, and everything will be set. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and this code will call force refresh token. I'm going to go back to Flutterflow, new code, action. Again, select all, delete, and then paste my code, and it's called force refresh token. I'm going to save, and that's it. This code doesn't need to be added to the main.dart. It will be added as an action after user creation in our Flutterflow app. So that is it for step 3.1, 3.2. 3.3 we've done already, which was to add our first piece of code to the final actions of the main.dart file. And now we're up to step number 4. So we're going to get set up for this and complete it just in a sec. Okay, so for step number 4, we're going to need to create a cloud function. Now, as I said earlier, this cloud function will run immediately when a user is created in Firebase. And what it will do, if I scroll down to the actual code, there is a logger function here that just logs information. If I scroll down a bit more, this is the cloud function that will run. So what it does, immediately it logs information. It just says that the function starts, and then it does this here. It will set a custom user claim on our new user. So for the user token, it will add this role authenticated. And that's what Supabase requires in order to just even recognize that a token may be authenticated. So as soon as a new user is created, this is what this does. On create, it will set the role to authenticated on our token, and then it will continue with a few steps that you may want to remove. In my case, when I create a user in Firebase, because I will use Supabase as my main backend, I want all my information to be in Supabase, even though we log in using Firebase. So whenever a new user is created in Firebase, I want to automatically create them in Supabase. And this is what this piece of the code does. So if you want to keep that logic in, keep the code. If you don't want it, just remove this part. And if you remove it, you can go and remove the create user in Supabase function that's just above. So this whole portion you can remove as well. If you do want to keep it, make sure that below these lines here, your Supabase schema is matching the column names here. So in my case, I have a users table with column ID, email, display name, and phone number. So when a new user is created in Firebase, I want to fetch that information and insert a row in Supabase. So that's what this code will do. As I said, if you don't want the auto user creation in Supabase, just remove the Supabase lines here, these 4 lines, and you should be good to go. So we're going to go ahead and create this cloud function. I'm going to copy this, go to Flutterflow. I'm going to go to cloud function, add a new function, select everything, remove, and I paste twice. So I'm I'm going to paste that. So we have our code here. I'm going to save. Now the name of the function will be, if I scroll down, process sign up. So I'm going to paste that there, save. And we have one more step before we can publish this cloud function. I'm going to go back to the guide, scroll up, and there's this line here. You can see it says Supabase with the version, and you have an image of what the package.json should look like. So we need to add this line here below the already existing line. So I'm going to go back to package.json, add a comma, enter, and paste my new line here. I think there is an issue with the quotes. There they are. So I'm going to save. And now I can go ahead and deploy this function. Okay, so our cloud function finished deploying. Now we need to change a tiny detail in Firebase. So actually on the cloud console. So if we look at this function that we just deployed, when we scroll down here, there's this section about updating the user in Supabase. So if you're going to go ahead and do that, we need to set these two variables, the Supabase URL and the Supabase key, so that our code can connect and insert the rows. So I'm going to go back to the guide. There is a quick link here. I'm going to click on that. That's going to take you to Cloud Console. Now, the first thing to do is to confirm in the top left here that you have the right project selected. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on my cloud function, then source. And then this is a product that Flutterflow pushed. So this is all the result of the Flutterflow cloud function deployment. And you can see here we have our code. That's exactly the one that we just deployed. And there's also this runtime config JSON. So we're going to click on that and click on edit. And you can go back to the guide, copy this if you want. And here, after this, I'm going to add a comma, enter, and paste this data. Sorry. So I'm going to remove this last comma. Here, you want to add your service role key from Supabase and the URL from Supabase. So if I go to Supabase, you're going to need to go to project settings, data API, and I'm going to go ahead and do that on my own here, but you want to reveal, copy, and paste that in between the brackets. And for the URL, you just take this URL here and paste it there. And once you're done, you click save and redeploy, and this will complete our cloud function deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up for the key, deploy, and then we'll continue with the rest. Okay, so now what we need to do is the last step, connecting Firebase to Supabase. So we're going to go to Supabase. We're going to go to project settings, authentication, and here we're going to click on third-party authentication. And you will see Firebase listed as a provider. We're going to click on here, and we're going to need our Firebase project ID. So I'm going to go back to the project settings, project ID. And what this will do is connect Supabase and Firebase. Effectively, Supabase will be looking at our Firebase project, which exposes a few tokens, and that's how they will validate the tokens. So once this is done, we're done with setting up the accounts and everything. So we could go back to Flutterflow, go to settings, and at this point, we're going to be using Firebase for authentication. So all your actions in Firebase will need, or in Flutterflow, will need to use Firebase for authentication. So if I go to login, or maybe it's called Auth. Okay, so let's take a look at this sign up page. So we'll take a look at the actions. I've got a bunch of errors, obviously, because I switched from Supabase Auth to Firebase. Okay, so this was supposed to be Supabase before, and now it's using Firebase automatically. Yeah, it's working automatically. So let's just quickly, just so you can see this force refresh token action. So on sign up, we're gonna in this case, we had the keyboard, we validate the email login form, we create an account in Firebase, which if we follow the chain of action, when we create a user in Firebase, if we go here, this cloud function will run. Okay, so once a user is created, this cloud function runs almost immediately after. It will add the role parameter to the JSON Web Token. And then in here, in the event that we navigate too quickly and then try to fetch Supabase info, which may cause the Firebase token not to have the role yet, in case our function here hasn't had time to process, we're going to add our new force refresh token action. So you need this here. So this will run for at most 1 second. So we'll create an account in the backend. The role parameter will be added to the token. This will force refresh a token. So it will tell Firebase to get us a new token. And once we get the new token, our other piece of code will run, set it as the Supabase default token. And then we could just use Supabase as per normal. Here, you could see in my database here, I have Supabase enabled. So I could use Supabase normally for all my queries. Now, the good part about this is that because we have Firebase as authentication, we can just enable notifications and we could deploy and it's going to work. So that's the magic of using Supabase with Firebase authentication. Now, the only thing that you may need to know about for the rest of the setup is that in Supabase, when you get the tokens, I'm just going to scroll down here to show you. In Supabase, when you set up RLS policies, usually you would use something like auth.uid and validate that against the Supabase user. Now, in this case, you won't be able to do that because it will be using the Firebase token. But what you can do here is store the Firebase user ID in Supabase. And then whenever you make a call to Supabase, this user ID will be available in the token that is calling. So my RLS policies will be using like something like this. Okay, so let's say I wanted to allow read, I would do select this would select the Firebase ID, and then I could do something like is equal to my table users dot ID. Or in your case, if you already have Supabase user information, maybe you name the column Firebase ID. And so that's how you can get around with using RLS policies with the Firebase token. Okay, so the last part of this video, I'm going to show you how I'm actually transferring my Supabase users to Firebase in order to use this setup. So I have an app with maybe 100 users, and I set the whole thing up during this video. So I don't have any users in Firebase. If you saw at the beginning, my users in Firebase are non-existent. But if I go to Supabase, go to the table editor and go to users, you can see we have about just over 100 users here, and all my app is set up around this column here, user UUID. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to scroll to the right. I'm going to add a new column named Firebase ID, and in this next step, what we're going to do is we're going to mass export our users from Supabase all the way to Firebase, and then log the Firebase user ID in this column, so that then on my next app update, we'll be using Firebase authentication, which will allow us to continue using Supabase, but then also have push notifications the easy way. So this Firebase ID is not a UUID, it's type text. I want this to be unique and it could be nullable. So I'm just gonna create this new column. So I have this new Firebase ID column. I'm gonna go back to the guide, and the way I'm gonna do this here is by using buildship. I built a piece of code that will run and transfer all my users to Firebase and then copy the ID over. So if you want to follow along with this and use BuildShip, you can go ahead and just copy this code. I'm going to go to BuildShip. It's a brand new account. I've created one flow, and what I've done is I went to settings, secret keys, and I've created 3 secret keys. The first one is the Supabase URL. Second one is the service role like earlier. And the last one is Firebase JSON. And to get this, you go to the project settings in Firebase, service accounts, and you just click the generate new private key. This will download a file that you can click and open in Notepad. So for example, if I go ahead and open it, just like this, you would copy everything and just paste it directly in the value for this. So if I go to edit, I would just paste that here, okay? And that's it. So I have these 3 secret keys. I'm just gonna go back and grab this code again. Okay, copy. And so in BuildShip, I'm gonna go back to my flow. We don't need any inputs. We don't need outputs. We just wanna run this once. So I'm gonna add a node. The node will be a starter script. Okay, there it is. I'm gonna open it. I'm just gonna delete everything and paste my code. So this code will take these 3 secret keys as parameters. And then here is where you need to customize the code for yourself. It will select my users from my table users. And in my case, I want to fetch the ones that have Firebase ID, the column, equal to null. So the ones that haven't been processed yet. Then what it will do is for each record that it found, so for each row, it creates a user in Firebase. And then from there, it will modify the custom claim, so the custom token, to have the role property, just like we did in Flutterflow. And then once that's done, it will go back to update that user in Supabase. And that's where you need to make sure that your columns match. So you can see, in my case, the user UUID is actually my ID column. So I will be doing this, UUID, and okay, and it will update my Firebase ID column. That's all good. One thing to keep in mind before running this code is that because we have this cloud function here that will trigger on new user creation, this code will process every user as they get created. But in my case, it will cause errors, obviously, because I have a unique constraint on this, but I'm just gonna let them run. It's not gonna double up my users, but if to be safe, you should disable this. Actually, let me see if we can disable it quickly. No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. So you would, before deploying this function, you would transfer your users and then deploy the function. And so before we can save this piece of code, go to inputs. We're going to remove that. We need 3 inputs. We need Supabase URL, Supabase service role, and then Firebase JSON. Okay, that's good. We could save. And here we're going to select our secrets. So URL, service role, and JSON. Okay, and we could just hit test, top right. And if everything is set up correctly, this will take a few moments, but it will transfer all our users. So create them in Firebase and then allow us to later use the Firebase authentication for our existing users. They'll have to either reset password or get us a passwordless sign-in link via email, but this will simplify our life a lot for notification and also other Firebase products like Crashlytics. Okay, so the code finished running, and if we go to Supabase and refresh this, we could see all of our rows processed correctly. And then if we go to Firebase authentication, we have a bunch of new users. Perfect. So this code worked correctly. So now technically we could use Firebase authentication with existing users, but because they've never actually connected with Firebase, they'll need to reset their password, like I said. And so back in Flutterflow, we are able to use push notifications now because we're using Firebase as authentication, but we also have other nice things. If you go to Firebase and scroll down, you can pretty much use anything here. And you could also use both. You could also use Firebase and Supabase as a backend and mix and match as you like. Okay, so that's it for setting up notifications the easy way. Once you do it once, it goes pretty fast for subsequent projects. This guide here will be available in the comments. And as I mentioned at the start, another good reference is the Flutterflow guide on connecting Firebase. If you like this video, please leave a like. Let me know if you have any questions or if you have any ideas for content that you might like. I'll see you in the next one.